Andante. Well, dear readers, what of these two figures immortalized in the painting up for discussion in the hall, shot through by slices of sunlight? They are based on drawings made by a young man who shared the Trapper's Road with a young couple 160 years ago. The young man filled homemade hide-wrapped journals with charcoal sketches. Later, an eager commercial magazine illustrator encountered the drawings while preparing for a historical publication, and being so taken by the intimate expressions on the faces, he rendered many oil paintings of the two. The many similar images in series showed the shades of relational meaning expressed in the faces of the subjects, together in context, like an animated flip book. Later, the series attracted the attention of a film studies professor at a university in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her father favored his mother, Susanna, in the hands and face. They looked out at the world to be known by serene, balanced features, communicating through poise, posture, effortless grace, passing a moderate temperament down through the generations. These natural gifts were matched with muscular hands at the ends of thick, powerful wrists, connected under the button cuffs to arms that were not easily twisted. Her father's hands and face spoke well for him with his friends, congregations, before the bar, and in negotiations. She favored her father's mother, who'd have been very proud of her granddaughter and husband on this fine, bright, late winter morning in question. Her grandmother, Susanna, followed the exploits of Lewis and Clark with anticipation for the exciting lives her children and grandchildren were going to inherit. While she enjoyed the celebrity gossip among friends and acquaintances shortly after the death of Mary Wollstonecraft, in the years after she'd read many of her works. She'd read Frankenstein together with her little granddaughter in Pigtails. Her mother would have been horrified. She would hear nothing of her daughter's wanderlust. When she spoke to her mother regarding her feelings, it was as if her breath, carrying the fragile words, was tainted with the rebellious grime of an adventuress's debauched insanity. Her mother comforted herself by talking over her, saying she was a lovely young girl being misguided by hubris and youthful histrionics. They had their most heated discussion on the matter in the kitchen, while driving out the deep, damp, bone-chilling winter cold, attempting to make the very ostentatious and trendy lemon meringue pie. They were having a party. Her mother compared a woman's ambition to the whipping of air into the sugary egg whites. She said it was a fragile concoction that would break and fall if overworked. She said it would shrink into a rubbery mess if overheated. Her mother was not swayed by the argument that humankind could not have covered every soon-to-be-known corner of the globe if women were not, as humans, along every step of the long and winding ways. Living like heathens, she spat. Hearing her mother's tone, she hopelessly held her tongue from deploying what she thought was her best argument. She quietly listened to it in her head. Mama, have you not considered at all the many generations of Negro women who have crossed the ocean to these hostile lands, suffered the most horrible brutalities, and for hundreds of years risen through it all and proven they are some pumpkins? It was easier to take her mother's words as true for her, and her advice with a pinch of salt. It was better to protect her sovereignty, her intentions, and hidden preparations to hightail it away. The last thing she said was, Mama, you may not entertain the debate, but Mother Nature surely knows the truth of what womankind can do. Oh, my sweetest heart, if that does not sound straight out of the mouth of my mother-in-law, a woman who loves to valorize the expeditions and refuses to acknowledge the misadventures. It was much easier to hide the face than the hands out under the relentless ultraviolence of the high desert sun. The aggressive winds barreled down the hollows out of the northwestern valley, and anyone out and about would have their faces covered. She used a handkerchief, wedged her head into a well-fitted hat over her cropped hair, and several layers of leather everywhere else to fend off the burrs and blades of the prairie grass. Her knee-length leather trapper jacket was beautifully embellished with embroidered red stars, trimmed out with a fringed 3-layer cape. There were spiked star spurs of grass seed that would catch and then twist and burrow deeper into the skin, aggressively, to get established and rooted, and thereby consume you into the desert landscape. A pair of sturdy hands, even gloved, spoke for themselves, saying to anyone who cared to mind their own business There goes two fellows riding out into the morning together to greet the day. Her little teacup terrier, Princess Jaja, was tucked into her coat breast. She was always helping to be on the lookout for coyotes. On the occasions they'd come into the towns, camps, and settlements to transact, Jaja's big bark would do all the talking. No one looked too hard at her covered face, but at her meaty, but at her meaty knuckles rubbing the chin of her little hillbilly foil. The night she left, she hoped her family wouldn't suspect she'd run out into the wild blue west because she took her little princess with her. She hoped they'd be thinking she was still living somewhere like a proper lady in St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, Boston at worst, just seeing the elephants. Maybe she's just trying her hand working as a seamstress or stenographer. She always pined about being independent, her mother said to mollify her father. She imagined her mother telling her father she'd been hoodwinked by the hyperbole of a con man into a brief destiny of love or fame. Even in that case, they knew she had a strong work ethic, and like a cat with a teacup terrier in her pocket, she'd land on her feet. They'd expect her to come to her senses and come home with a dirty hem, a little worse for wear, but wearing it well. Even so, her father hired and dispatched several henchmen to visit St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston to hunt for her. Hanover, Pennsylvania, a long, prosperous town at the intersection of two major roads, 14 miles east of Gettysburg, 100 miles west of Philadelphia, had until recently also been the home of her new husband. He was the son of the town's best dentist, who was himself an outdoor enthusiast and botanical hobbyist. His particular passion was herpetology. He trained his son in bushcraft in the back country of the Pocono Mountains, studying the life cycles of the salamander, making journeys through the late winter storms to be present for when the bright orange ests emerged into the world of cliffs and waterfalls. Her father had gone to his father to have a molar pulled the day before the start of a trial, and his father had gone to her father to exonerate her husband when he was accused of horse theft. With his reputation so damaged, the young man was sent away to Boston to school. Before he departed, he gave the young daughter of his lawyer a bust stay carved with a panoramic vista in relief. The sun or full moon loomed in mountain valleys, bisected by two waterways, and trees marching down to the banks at the outer edge of the picture. She kept it in the little center pocket of her stay, and they sent letters back and forth by way of a mutual friend. Their clandestine attraction turned into a fully fledged and executed plan of elopement and escape. They decided to absquatulate late in the afternoon as the meringue pie rested, ostensibly heading out on legitimate errands. In fact, they were heading northwest, a man, woman, and princess on horseback. They rode 200 miles to Elmira, New York, where they took one of the first canal boats of the season along the Chemung Canal, which had only been completed the previous year. From Seneca Lake to the Cayuga and Seneca Canals, also just completed, they began to feel less urgency to vanish. By the time they arrived at the Erie Canal at Montezuma, they truly felt on the brink of the future and parts unknown. Hand in hand, knowing and known only to each other, they felt as though they were riding on the head of a mystic and powerful dragon at their command. They got married in Buffalo and boarded the steamboat across Lake Erie to Chicago. They left at the earliest signs of change from winter to spring, so the late ice would break on the bow of the boat. The frontier would not be so for much longer. They firmly believed they needed to get out there, and not just out of here, while the getting was still good. They'd have all year to cross the continent with no real plan other than on 3 horses. They could not have imagined how many thousands of miles lay bathed in the intoxicating scent of sun-warmed cedar, juniper, and sagebrush. They had the great good fortune to meet and travel with a trapper named Henry. He'd traveled in prior seasons with a heroic mountain man named Jedediah Smith, one of Ashley's 100, before he died the previous year in the territory of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico. Smith had shown Henry the way of the South Pass, through the Wind River high country that twisted the cedars and junipers into stunted and fantastical poses. They'd hidden their clutches of pelts and supplies in the crevices of the red sandstone castles of Cache Valley, under the carved, watchful faces of petroglyph spirits, choosing when and to whom they'd reveal themselves. They'd traversed the scope of the Great Basin desert like ghosts. The meadows of tiny bursting technicolor buckwheat flowers were swept by the expanding panoply of stardust and vibrant constellations in the pitch-black darkness of night over the harsh land. Henry orbited the young couple as they traveled, guiding their journey as he trapped through the seasons. They surmounted the peaks of the Sierra Nevadas and crossed the continent together before the heavy snows came. The young couple sat on the edge of a small lake in the southernmost elevations of the Cascade Mountain Range, in the northernmost part of the Great Valley in what would very soon come to be known as California. A boiling kettle of juvenile white and gray gulls harassed one another over hovering positions. Reflections off the shallow waters brought down the layered purple hues of mountains beyond mountains, the white peaks alive through the up and down jostling of the birds. The shadow dancing of their bodies dragged the colors across the snow and looked to her like the sheet music of Haydn's oboe concerto in C major she'd been working on before they left the East. Listening to the overlapping ensembles of frogs fighting off the cold, singing for their lives in the water's edge, she heard the swooping rises and hyperventilating trills of the allegro spirituoso solo. Her imagination was haunted by the terrible loneliness of those hours spent practicing alone. Those hours were precious time of her short life, utterly wasted for nothing, for no one. The squawking gulls must have brought down the lonely spirit of a monstrous snow giant from the still and silent peaks on their wings. Broken reflections on the water swam in her eyes as hot tears pooled from deep in her throat and rolled down her dirty cheeks. We surely planned this perfectly timed to try our hands at trapping in the busy season. In this cold the pelts will be thick. We made it, my darling, her husband began to say, and then he looked over to her. Tenderly fingering the steam coming off of her hot, wet face, he said, "The years surely will be too few before the trappings of civilization catch up to us, and I will find myself putting a string of pearls around your handsome neck, my love." Emotions welled in his eyes, and he kissed hers, his dry lips stung by her wet tears. "I will cherish these days between us, lacing these strings of trailing embers from our campfire into the parade of stars above us, all the more when that day comes. Listening to this private orchestra of crickets deafening the night, being consumed hand in hand with you as the plots of our journey unfold. I could not share a greater promise with you than this string of vignettes in which we are leads. Truly, this adventurous honeymoon is the greatest blessing a man could ever receive from God Almighty in heaven above, and here on this wild earth as it is in heaven, consuming, hand to mouth, the raw, majestic indifference of this beautiful world as my prayers answered. I feel consumed, profoundly nourished by our love, in all corners of my heart. My body is warmed to the core against all chills, growing fonder as every moment passes." He turned his attention back to a set of poached eggs simmering in the skillet over the hissing fire. "Darling," she replied after digesting his romantic poetry, "do you remember the morning before the light began to quicken, when we opened our tent to see everything shrouded in fog and hoarfrost? We could not see any further than the silhouette of the leafless trees' contorted branches. The birds gripped the twigs, singing so bravely in the gloom, searching to discover faces and figures in the haze to pass the time. How the shapes of the trees appeared, swept in such elegant curves by the wind over the ridge. The dormant, brittle grass was blooming with ice crystals. That could have been the last day of my life, and I would have died so happy and content." She bowed her head and kissed the top of his hand. The first of 2 major railroads were completed and put into service as they sat and spoke. Perhaps if the nation hadn't become distractedly embroiled by the ideology of war, the rail lines would have chased them down sooner, marched across the country and tracked them down. In any case, the coming of interstate highways was swift and inevitable, and while the flood of travel east to west united the feelings of the nation as it united the young couple in feeling, all locales were obliterated. The travelers were not only ghosts to themselves, never anyone or anywhere, but they were shrouded in an aura of homogeneity that destroyed the distinct, all local languages, birdsong, flora, and fauna. The Pacific Highway would be built in fewer than 100 years. It would terminate very near, practically on top of them if they'd stayed sitting there, drinking in the humid musk rising from the land, warming in the late morning sun. Soon there would be homesteads, followed by hotels. Soon the hotels would have neon signs and truck parking out back. The people these young lovers took the chance to be would be forever impossible again.